I've hosted two really interesting panels here today at APPEC, both on carbon markets. So our first one, we kicked off talking mainly about CORSIA markets. So we heard from the aviation space about how they're tackling or grappling with the different options they have through the CORSIA framework. They can either look at low carbon fuels or the carbon crediting side of CORSIA. Now we heard some arguments there that perhaps airlines should be doing all they can through the fuel side of things before they start to use offsets and carbon credits to meet their obligations under CORSIA. But we did also discuss that there are some natural limitations there on the availability of SAF, for one thing, that's sustainable aviation fuel, but also on the limitations of CORSIA eligible carbon credits. Now, in terms of carbon abatement costs, carbon credits are actually giving better value, but there are definite limitations in the availability there. And that's really been the big story of CORSIA for 2025, and really since we entered into phase one of the scheme in 2024. What we see is in our Platts CEC price assessment, which tracks CORSIA eligible credits, prices of around $22 to $22.25 most recently. And in the grand scheme of things in the carbon markets, that's actually a relatively premium kind of price. And that comes down to the fact that for the time being, there is really just one project, and that's the Trees project, which is eligible under the CORSIA framework. We also track different project types which are meeting at least one of the criteria outlined by ICAO for CORSIA eligibility, and they're trading at a discount to the sort of fully eligible CORSIA credits of $6 to $6.25 we've seen most recently. But again, that's still relatively high prices in carbon credit terms, and again, that does really come down to limited supply. And that's one of the headwinds we discussed on the panel of the CORSIA framework, or the CORSIA program as people see it at the moment. The limited availability of credits, how long it's taking for some of these credits to get their corresponding adjustment under the ICAO framework, which will make them eligible. But we also discussed sort of penalty mechanisms and lack of clarity over how the program will look in the coming years, given the slow ramp up of phase one. And that's sort of giving some question marks around how CORSIA will play out in the coming years. On our other panel today, we discussed carbon dioxide removals. They are really another premium segment of the carbon market. There's this perception that it's preferable to be removing emissions from the atmosphere, and these kind of credits also are trading at quite a premium. We dug into the biochar space, where those credit prices are way above $100 per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. And we talked about how these markets can scale. At the moment, they really take up a relatively small portion of buyers' blended carbon credit portfolios at the moment, and that is coming down to both their high price and limited supply of these removals kind of credits. So we talked about biochar, we talked about BECCS, for example. We also heard from some of our panelists around the financing of these kind of projects, and the fact that perhaps there's an additional level of fragmentation there. There are relatively small BECCS projects, for example, and our panelists suggested that perhaps we need this greater sort of M&A activity and merging of different projects in order to bring that scale that is really going to attract some of the necessary financing from the banking space into the carbon dioxide removals area. So really, across both of our panels, we heard about limitations on supply, some of these premium level prices in the carbon space. But we also heard that buyers are still pretty price sensitive when it comes to buying carbon dioxide removals or avoidance credits. And that is really one of the factors that's going to continue to dictate the carbon markets going forwards.